I'm going to start my presentation with this image that I'm sure many of you recognize. And little did we know as children dancing to the rhythm of this infamous 1980s disco song by the village people, the YMCA, that the lyrics refer to the residential hotels built by the Youth Men's Christian Association throughout the US. The song reflected in an almost humorous manner upon the everyday life of the blue and white collar workers who dwelt between the streets and the sheets, coexisting in these diverse open places where everyone is welcome. You can get yourself clean, you can have a good meal, you can do whatever you feel. The song quickly became a touchstone for queer culture, as some of these residential hotels known as the Ys were popular cruising spots based on local folklore, so the connection was inevitable. On the other hand, contemporary scholars narrate a different story about the democratic nature of the YMCA residential hotels that includes moral reforming and the surveillance and control over the social life of its occupants, monitoring even their visitors, amongst other occurrences, in order to suppress crimes against nature. During the 20th century, when wage labor and the expansion of capitalism overturned the self-sufficient household production system, a way was paved for individuals who sought to pursue the life of their own. With the wider industrialization and modernization processes, the rise of labor and housing demands, the 1900s rooming house, following the decline and social marginalization of the boarding house, manifested as a key component in this transitioning narrative. Traditionally, the structure of single-room dwellings, purposely built by the turn of the century for the working class, was an establishment comprised solely of bedrooms, deprived of any amenities and services. As claimed by the BBC documentary Loneliness, broadcasted in 1957, the number of men living alone in single-room dwellings had doubled since the 1930s. Surprisingly, it was in the same broadcast that homosexuality was mentioned for the first time by a national radio station. Besides being stigmatized and slandered in tabloids for their green rooms and their lives of squalor, homosexuals were presented as deviant, accused of taking advantage of this radical invention to be disguised, of course, as single men. So opposed and criticized by religious conservative middle-class reformers for challenging the nuclear family and traditional domestic settings, the rooming house, neither a hotel nor a house, but the category of the residential hotel, is often introduced as a fundamental type without any connection to its historical origin. So this presentation will examine the historical and overlapping complexities related to the queer subject, the single bed, and the emergence of the rooming house, arguing that the larger theoretical questions about the neglected yet contradicting by nature category of queer domesticity can be framed by considering the concept of type. I want to make a small parenthesis about the notion of queer. So this notion was interpreted or used in various ways since the 16th century, from being synonym to the term of eccentric or strange to acquiring a negative meaning in the 19th century. During the last decades, though, many literary theorists, philosophers, and historians, such as Deleuze or Sedgwick, have translated queer theory as a critique on traditional identity politics, which introduce new ways of thinking beyond social and sexual practices. And these theories align with Mark Whiteley's contribution to sexuality and space, where he referred to the general spectrum of sexual and gender identities as being misplaced when it comes to reading the history of domestic space. So departing from these discussions, the notion of queer that I'm putting forward in this presentation is therefore one that makes reference to the subjectivity, one that resists societal constraints and existing patterns, to what David Halperin explained in Saint Foucault towards a gay hagiography as deriving from its oppositional relation to the norm, the legitimate, the dominant. So acknowledging Sedgwick's claim that the notion of queer has expanded into outward dimensions that can be subsumed under gender and sexuality at all, I suggest that the struggle for a private life and the lack of belonging should be taken into account as common attributes for associating subjects from different social groups within the queer spectrum. So queer is therefore an umbrella term, in my understanding, that can be used to define those marginalized and minorized whose existence deviates from the existing and prevailing social order. What I will present today is a critique on the paradoxical yet unanimous argument that seems to be traced in contemporary queer theories concerning the relationship between queer subjectivity and space. These spaces are imagined as not viewed, only implied and usually invisible, and are experienced by the subject with the hope to define a sexual sense of self or to host sexual acts, as claimed by Aaron Betsky in this book, Queer Space. Over-sexualized, viewed as theatrical, it is not naive to say that the queer subject was solely ever thought of as being outside the domestic sphere. But as we know, throughout history, domesticity has always been a governmental and oppressive place where the typologies produced, the social structures and gender roles involved are in many ways predefined, making it the most vivid category to capture how life takes form. So I will argue that queer domesticity is not abstract, nor does it have to do only with upper class individuals and their exceptional villas. But this category of queer domesticity is invoked in the case I will be analyzing as a recent and planned extension of this category. And its origin dates back to modern times, in which can identify the ambitions, the struggle, the constraints, and the everyday life of the queer subject dominated by the cultural ideals of heteronormative relationships. So the question I'm putting forward is, what contribution can a paradigm of queer domesticity make to the discussion for a fifth typology by focusing on a seemingly ahistorical and figuratively abstract form of habitation, the rooming house? So the queer subject appeared historically, symbolically at least, in the public eye with the imprisonment of Oscar Wilde, the infamous writer and leader of the aesthetic movement, who was put on trial for decency in 1895. So with the emergence of wage labor, individuals were liberated from depending upon a family unit, and homosexuality during the end of the 19th century came to be affiliated as an identity of personal choice rather than being perceived as a behavioral condition. And that is when a new homosexual hedonism rose that extended in domestic space by those privileged enough who could afford their right to privacy. So 20th century state records are informative on the barbarism that took place in the queer households of the lower class, documented more profoundly in the US, related to a bizarre national obsession with publicly outing homosexuals. So this condition, it was intensified as queer individuals dove into sex-segregated situations such as the army, or most importantly, in affordable single-room dwellings such as the rooming house. And I argue that the single-room occupancy seems to be one of the first paradigms of queer domesticity for the unprivileged, and it can be interpreted as one embodying an orthodox form of life that went against accepted traditional ideas of middle-class suburban homemaking practices and societal pressures of its time. So in the late 1800s, when the germ theory was gradually acknowledged and the dominant fear of the miasma theory was challenged, the single bed became the instrument for exploring the dynamic of the heteronormative relationships, from the twin bed system contributing towards domestic hygiene to a desirable one offering a sense of individuality in a co-sleeping setting. So although demonized in this case, the single bed quickly became the apparatus through which the bedroom was shaped in architectural spatial practices. But the bedroom was rarely exposed till then. It was, although it was a place rarely exposed till then, it became, during the same era, the center of attention for Anglo-American writers such as Virginia Woolf, who advocated for a room of one's own as a necessity that nurtures creativity and establishes intellectual freedom. Yet decades later, Paul Groth, referring to the case of the single-room occupants in San Francisco, described it as an economic and residential limbo, where discrimination appeared to dominate every level of an individual's quest for independence, especially for minorities. And to the queer community, and for those especially who belonged into the lower class, the single-room dwelling was unfortunately the only option available. So Groth, referring to the homosexual couples of that era, states that apparently they didn't provoke any suspicion. It was very easy for them to live as pairs in these single-room dwellings. And some rooming houses districts were known to be areas that gay men or lesbian lived in and frequented. So nurtured by the real estate industry and by companies who desired cheap labor, This eventually became a home for those living in the margin, not only temporarily, but in many cases indefinitely. But how did this phenomenon arrive to existence, and especially in San Francisco, that became sort of the apparatus, actually, that the city also took form. So by 1848, San Francisco had one of the most important ports in the area and was considered the base for miners who sought employment in the gold field. So gold and silver found their ways into banks, and as a central point for commerce, San Francisco eventually became a banking and financial stronghold, as well as a conduit for international trade. So to address the rapid growth of populations, farming and manufacturing were developed. Miners, traders, and the nomads of the time migrated to the city following the gold rush in 1850, who were not only Anglo-Americans, but came from many other countries of Latin America as well, forging trading relations with the locals. And in this map that was designed in 1853, one can see the city grid spreading outward from its port, with the larger blocks south of Market Street, where actually the first boarding houses were built to accommodate these needs. But what is a residential hotel? The commercial hotel is defined by the majority of states in the US as being an establishment or house that rents 6 or more guest rooms. The interesting thing is that the title of a residential hotel unit is not attributed to the building per se, but actually to the single room dwelling when the duration of stay exceeds 1 month, and so the occupant is legally considered permanent resident of the city. And until the 1960s, there were 4 dominant types of residential hotels that were produced in San Francisco, addressing in other cities of the US, addressing in different ways the form of the household, the amenities, the proximity to neighbors, the surrounding land uses, and the relationship with personal possession, which is very important. So in San Francisco, one could trace palace hotels, mid-price hotels, boarding houses, and rooming houses. And written records actually suggest that these were in fact categorized according to the social status of their occupants. And rooming houses were actually described as plain hotels for plain people, and were usually 2 to 4 decades old, mostly row houses, had multiple stories, and were used prior to being rooming houses by middle-income families as boarding houses. So the non-existing dining service meant that less servants were needed and that more rooms were available to be transformed into bedrooms. The former boarding house usually had approximately 16 or more rooms, including the owner's kitchen and bathroom and the laundrette. And the larger rooms were usually subdivided into additional smaller rooms. In many cases, there were not sufficient lighting or ventilation, and only a small number of rooms had central heating or individual stoves. And these rooms, as well as the ones that were situated on the upper floors or in the end of the hallway, were the cheapest ones to rent. In addition, the furniture was very limited in number. For example, in contrast to mid-price hotels, in rooming houses, 2 chairs were the maximum one would typically have, including a sink, a bowl, and a pot. They only had 1 bathroom, usually the one that was originally constructed, and the number of baths one could have, in many cases, were limited to 1 hot bath per week. But by 1910, commercial rooming houses were run with the use of official permits, and this meant that a lot of these problems were actually solved. And they were actually built because ambitious owners believed that they would bring like a steady and reliable rent for a long time. So other factors were included in the design, such as higher ceilings were taken into account, issues of lighting and ventilation were solved. Bathrooms remain limited and found usually at the end of the corridor. But what can be characterized as the dominant type of that era is the National Hotel you see on the photo here, which was built in 1906. This large rectangular in shape residential hotel was comprised of around 50 square single-room dwellings, 2 bathrooms and a toilet on each floor. The analogy was 1 bathroom per 25 rooms, and this is crazy. Each room had a sink, a mirror, a closet, and a bed. And these insufficient small windows you see here that over the air shaft were forbidden in the housing regulations that followed 4 to 5 years after this was built. Common spaces were reduced and limited only to the narrow corridor and to the small lobby in front of the manager's office, which is the one on the top right. And the rooming house of this era for growth represent an urban variation of vernacular design processes. And he explains that by saying that this is because of the synergy between the landowner, the architect, and the real estate agent involved, whose goal was not only to meet with the general desires of the market, but also the specific ones of mostly long-term residents. Although the layout remained the same, adjustments to the interior details, lighting, furniture, facades, or entrances were made by demand. So rooming houses were considered a popular choice amongst the unmarried as it provided a respectful amount of privacy in comparison to other types of residential hotels, contributing towards the formation of a queer subculture. The author Lisa Ben, who eventually became the first lesbian publicist who initiated the first lesbian publication in the US titled Vice Versa, moved into a rooming house in Los Angeles in pursuit of secretarial work during the last years of the war. And in her diary, the first thing she says is, "I got my own room with kitchen privileges, and from there I met some gay girls. They were all sunbathing on the garage roof, and they started talking, and she got to listen to them, and they exchanged some personal information. And after that, they eventually introduced her to the city, where she went to her first gay bars. She went for the first time to a girls' softball game. So after World War I, all these diaries and oral histories revealed that the queer community was able to build an effective network based on collective and shared experiences, and the rooming house actually played a very important role in this network. They were organizing drag balls, cruising in the parks and streets, gathering in public bathhouses and YMCAs. They sustained literary societies and meaningful social interactions. The newspaper of the time even informed us about how working class women, one of them passing as a man, living in a rooming house, would eventually become legally married by establishing a forged civil identity, of course. But condemned by the law, church, and science, homosexuals were considered for the better part of the century as sexual perverts. Eisenhower banned their employment from any public service. And besides being excluded from the military, their organized meeting places were monitored by the FBI. Their mail was traced by the post office. Their homes were surveyed by vice squads who searched for evidence of homosexuality. These witch hunts set the goal to entrap any form of anomaly, not only in public, but in private. So as these rooming houses grew rapidly and the residents grew rapidly, there was this wave of religious and philanthropic organizations that became strongly opposed to such unconventional domestic settings. And they worked hard to bring back boarding houses that were more controlled. And they were not always inclusive, often sponsoring according to ethnicity, race, or religion. But needless to say, the 20th century rooming houses marked the beginning of what can be described, in my opinion, as queer domesticity, being the predecessor to what followed decades later, solidarity movement and other cohabitation forms of dwelling, liberated to an extent from their oppressive domestic structure and the predatory character. According to Carlos Martieri's typology, looks to find structural similarities or links between things and tries to establish common etymological roots that underlie different phenomena. Then again, one might find it difficult to typologically analyze rooming houses as they derive from boarding houses, thus from any domestic setting that could be transformed to accommodate the needs of such establishments. In addition, 18th century rationalistic thoughts on typology based on reason, abstraction, concerning oppositional standards or logical principles reduced to figurative interpretations ran the danger of turning the discussion, the debate, into an ambiguous dogmatic one that subsumes critical thinking, failing to recognize the complexity of the rooming house. One could also argue that the bedroom alone is not a home, considering the common perceptions and heteronormative ideas of domesticity. But on the other hand, there is a strong kinship between the rooming house as a non-type paradigm, the single bed, both as a symbolic and spatial entity, and queer subjectivity that diverges from any existing typical category. Besides the understanding of the sociopolitical forces involved, the familiarity that uses and handles, as translated and assessed by Georgia Gutman, can be instrumental for capturing the notion of queer domesticity and for elaborating on this non-type paradigm. Beyond Marx's conception of use based on value, Agamben's projection of the term refers to the simple act of using something opposed to any sense of appropriation. Use offers a critical perspective on the relationship between the self and form of life, between body and being, between essence and existence. Contradicting the brokenness of possession, the reductive spirit of function and legal authorization, the sense of everyday use for Agamben is the core of being in the world. So, although this 1940s description of a rooming house in San Francisco ironically states that it offers a complete dwelling, one could argue that queer domesticity in the context of this paradigm manifests as an incomplete yet unconventional category, where the traditional functions of a house, besides a bedroom, are scattered, existing outside the structure of the rooming house. Everydayness is organized around a diagrammatic almost structure of interior subdivisions comprised of bedrooms, where mundane, daily, even domestic activities take place outside in the street with the presence of the public eye. So the laundromat 2 blocks away, the diner in the end of the street, the park at the corner, the bathhouse 3 doors down, amongst other familiar and unfamiliar places, appear as an extension of the single-room dwelling and have been characterized as the heart of the queer community in these oppressive times. The subject, departing from the microcosmos of a heteronormative domestic setting, is inevitably confronted with the city and with others who chose a similar path in life, seeking refuge in this eccentric form of habitation. And it is, in my opinion, by considering the notion of use, that the idea of an undefined queer domesticity can be realized and put into question, and a typological logic may find its way by focusing on the parallel production of life, type, and subject. Thank you very much.
Just to remind you to our respondents when we speak on the mic. So once
Thanks very much. It's a really wonderful, amazing piece of work so far. So it's really exciting for me to see. And I kind of want to shout, I'm queer after I see this presentation. Yeah, it's a really amazing way of framing queerness in a sense. So I love it. Yeah. I mean, one question that came to mind is, maybe in a sense, I guess I'm really just kind of curious about where the work is going, and what kinds of examples in a contemporary context. And I don't know if you're sticking to San Francisco or the Bay Area, but what kind of examples in the contemporary context would you look at? Because somehow it seems to me that the idea of categorization may have shifted spheres, and of course, a lot of these kind of categorizations that used to happen have fallen away, but there are maybe new forms of categorization and new forms of things operating, probably not just architecturally, but legally, financially, et cetera, in the city, that are producing a really dramatically dark kind of situation there somehow. So yeah, I mean, I guess one thing I'm wondering is how much the work might be really productive by engaging also with the kind of underlying and invisible things that underpin architectural production in the Bay Area. So, for example, planning regulations, legal and financial restrictions on things. I mean, I don't know, maybe for you, it's a question of whether in this kind of context you can operate, being very projective, but whether in this kind of context you can operate spatially, formally through type at the level of architecture, or if we also need to somehow discuss the underlying situation there, some other underlying other aspects of how architecture is being produced there somehow.
Actually, I don't understand your comment because it's a question I also do to myself, because this is I've never been to San Francisco, but the truth is that, I mean, this is a part of history now. I mean, this phenomenon happened in a very specific time frame, and somehow dramatically within decades it sort of vanished. But it would be interesting to study, I mean, some more content and some other contemporary examples, or what other forms, because of course, as you've said, and I agree, this is a category that goes beyond, I think, I think this debate on type, at least what it gave to me personally. I know the topic is about typology and the discussion about the fifth typology, but for me, it gave me the opportunity to discover what queer domesticity is, because somehow it's a very problematic, almost vague spectrum. And yeah, I don't have an answer. I
guess one question it's in my mind is what is queer domesticity in that context now somehow.
Yeah,
exactly. And it's I think you should go. It's one of the most shocking places in the world, I think, city. So
no, I mean, if my lab is funding me to go, I will definitely go. And I know Victoria went a lot of times to San Francisco, so maybe we could do like a group.
But it's the most expensive city in the world right now.
But what is man in front of, I mean, constant knowledge.
Okay, so thank you, Marco. I have some questions, mainly also based on this lens that the symposium is proposed about typology. So my first question is, I try to understand in which way you think you take benefits from the fact of considering the rooming house as a historical issue. I can't understand why.
It's seemingly historical.
Yes.
It's the way I phrased it. It was, I mean, it's something that is seemingly historical, but I mean, from my own research, I could trace its origin and its development throughout. I mean, from the boarding house, the rooming house. So somehow that's a step forward, which means there is somehow a history behind it.
Okay, no, I didn't understand that. In fact, you consider that there is a history to be in a sort of sketched out or unveiled. So you mean that this history is a United States one? Is limited to which kind of frame are you thinking to give it? Because just my question was based on the fact that, in fact, I couldn't really understand the way which you make equal Paris on one side, San Francisco on the other side, the Exposition Universelle and the 50s, 40s, 50s. Why I'm telling that? Because yeah, I mean, there is a sort of a more wide framing in which I have quite the impression that from the typological point of view, the rooming house could be in a productive way be framed before entering the issue of the queer subject. Because in fact, you are dealing with two things, a queer subject and the rooming house.
Yeah.
And they are going to intersect, but also they are other, winding trajectories. And for sure, what I understand is that the rooming house is a device for emancipation, let's put like that in a way. And so it is a bit subordinated to queer subject. At the same time, just to consider, you mentioned Paris, and Paris maybe is one of the cities where the living in one room was really designed in the Haussmann Paris for sure. A Paris where you shown us it has been proposed to bourgeois to separate their children into 2 bedrooms. And we had already this discussion together. In fact, please consider maybe this picture not a fact, but an utopia, knowing that until the 50s in French middle class, children remained in the same bed. I do not know until which age. And this is maybe important also to understand in which way maybe.
I think it's something I forgot to mention that, I mean, to stress that, and I agree with your comment, there was a vagueness in the connection between the two, that, I mean, the rooming house was not like in other cases, such as a presentation we saw earlier of Theodora's, where, I mean, she tried to study the origin of the social housing. So, I mean, there was this settlement that was designed for poor people. In my case, it wasn't designed for the queer subject. It was designed for the working class and for people who were making like the minimum wage. But that is why I had to mention that the queer subject really emerged through these processes of and the rise of wage labor. And that is where the connection with the rooming house is, in my opinion, very important.
It is interesting because I worked on other places, on Geneva, and the rooming house really emerged at the moment in which the city became a big administrative center. Yes. So linked more on another kind of classes, and so with also projects that have been not maybe put realized, but they show also something which is beyond the elementary needs of having a room, but to imagine a ways of living. This is also maybe I'm really wondering if you will be also. It could be also interesting for you to try to put a dialectic between projects of single living in a more collective houses and realization, and trying to find maybe this possible typological level of observation that seems today be a bit marginal. But
yes.
Just a reaction.
No, I think it's important. It's important.
Thank you. Thank you so much, Constantinos. It was like also for me incredibly interesting, and it sparks a number of reflections. Maybe first to start from one thing that I don't think is so central to the conversation, but I think it's worth mentioning because I'm guessing that you know it very well, but I don't know how familiar the audience is with the case study. There's an underlying theme of race here, right? Because one of the reasons why many of these working class people went into rooming houses at the beginning is that they couldn't actually bring their families with them. So in a way, there was a design not to let them reproduce. And of course, also queer people reproduce, equally as non-queer people, right? And this kind of, continued on from a colonial tradition where you didn't want your slaves to reproduce, right? Because they cost you less if they died like at 32 rather than if they produced actually children that you had to rear and so on and so forth. So I think that there is also an idea that the system starts by forbidding people to reproduce themselves somehow. And then it's quite interesting that the queer community then hijacks that by saying, but maybe we might or we might not want to reproduce. But anyway, I mean, it shouldn't become a duty somehow. I find that kind of, inversion, almost like, queering of the idea of reproduction, quite interesting because it starts actually from a violence. Think, for instance, of the Chinese workers who arrived here and couldn't bring their family, maybe they had, a significant other and they couldn't actually bring because women could not immigrate initially, right? So it's also a very male environment, right? I like that at a certain moment you bring in also the female subject, but the truth is that most of these rooming houses at the beginning were really, intensely male. That to me is interesting if we go back to the question of queerness, because I think Brandon's question about how queerness also, shifted and mutated through time, to me brings in a question. I really like that you bring this kind of inclusive focus where, the term queer, as you said, is an umbrella term. So it has this very big advantage of being inclusive. However, I'm wondering whether at certain points of your story, what we are really talking is really specifically gay men or gay women, which of course is a sub category, within the queer spectrum. Because maybe in certain cases, actually, we have to assume a more specific subject.
Yes.
And why not? I think, gay men have their own culture that is not necessarily coincident, equivalent basically to queer culture. Sometimes it's even in conflict, in fact. And so I think I would not shy away from that.
No.
Maybe because recently I've been doing a lot of readings. Like there is an Italian theorist, Mario Mieli, who wrote a really interesting book that is called actually for a theory of homosexual critique. And it assumes a very, very specific standpoint, very specific bias within the queer, constellation. I think I can imagine that the thesis will want to have probably like a queer perspective, so a more broader ecumenical approach. But I think within that, at certain moments in the thesis, why not assume a more specific standpoint that can be, the lesbian, or can be the gay, or the trans, when we go more recently, which I think becomes super interesting when you shift towards the end of the century, actually. So that's, so basically I'm going from, the question of race to the question of, what kind of queerness and how queerness is also historical somehow, and historically placed and so on and so forth. Then if we move more specifically to the question of queer subjectivity and type, what I found super interesting of the case study that you show us is that it's obviously very difficult to make like a one-to-one correspondence to, what is a queer take on type. And it's great that you're bringing up this is the right image, because I think if I have to try to explain it to myself, and to be honest, it's something that I've tried to do many times, and, listening to you, it falls more into place. My feeling is that what is interesting here is that the queer subject really delayers rest, intimacy, and sex, particularly, that normally find their own place in the large bed. So now the single bed is really it's pretty much actually only for sleeping.
Yes.
You are going to have sex somewhere else. You don't need to have sex on a bed, which, by the way, is a very bourgeois trope, right? I mean, you can have, and also doesn't mean that sex and intimacy are the same thing. Something else that I think is amazing about queer culture is this profound understanding that you can have great intimacy with someone and not have sex. And you can also have sex with someone without necessarily having intimacy. So for me, the single bed really becomes actually the index of the fact that you can delayer basically all these forms of human interaction that the bourgeois family apartment really overlaps. You're going to be intimate, intellectually, emotionally, sexually, and so on and so forth with just one person in just one place. Because also another thread that I think is somewhere in there is also the possibility of polyamory, right? So the fact that, of course, there might have been couples in here, but there might have also been associations that are a little bit more elastic somehow, right? So I think that to me then when it gets back to type is really this delayering. We are not going to actually have all of these functions, functions is the wrong word perhaps, but let's say these moments all in one, we are going to delayer all of them. Because we delayer them, each of them becomes incredibly abstract. It becomes really simplified to this bare minimum. You only need 2 meters by 90 centimeters to sleep, like literally like that, and nothing more. So typologically, that's very interesting because then it's a very radical delayering of all the functions. Again, it triggers the question that we had this morning, whether type has anything to do with function at all, or maybe not, right?
And even the idea of domestic space.
Yeah,
I think
completely.
That's the most problematic category.
Completely.
I think.
And so I want to get to a final point because I already spoke a lot, but one thing that to me is also interesting is that this to me suggests a different way of looking at type that is not only spatial, but is also temporal somehow, right? So the idea that the type can become a chronotope in which it's really the interaction between, how time and space are handled that can be also continuously reprogrammed, right? And I think that these are very, very fascinating themes for me. But really, especially the double bed, the single bed. I love that you put the single bed actually in the title because there's something so profound about it, about the possibility of individuality, of the possibility of creating much more elastic and varied relationships actually with others as an individual. And that's something that I find really crucial.
And this was I want to say something about the first. I think it aligns with the last thing you said, that I mean even immigrants try to hijack San Francisco and the system through the rooming house. And it's a debate I had with myself because I started reading about the aftermath of the earthquake, where they actually tried to resettle all the immigrants outside the city. So, I mean, they did use the rooming house as a way to at least put themselves back in the city and in the and back to work, whereas their family were left. So the Bedford one in that case, I mean, even symbolically, it tells a different narrative than in the case of the gay man or of the lesbian. And there was a point that I had to choose. I had to focus on one specific. I mean, I had to say that I'm referring to the lesbians and to the gays, and a bit leave behind the narrative of the immigrant. But I mean, I did read a lot, and it's very interesting that they also had their own network and their own culture. I don't like the word subculture, but that's what it was. And we see all this common thread that that in fact, I don't know, this is a conclusion I have, but I think it's very early and naive to say, but I do think that the idea of queer is not as vague as we think. If we take into account all these narratives. And
just one thing to add, so based on what Maria is saying about type, I think one other example that is really interesting in the early history of California is the camp and the placer mine camps, where also, I guess, we have the emergence of gay men and queerness, but also in what's striking about that is it's the absolute opposite of this condition. So if I put these two types next to each other, the placer mine is a kind of ground that gets modified, hopefully kind of flat, maybe a bit sloped, etc. And then a group of men actually setting up not only the labor of producing of mining, but also reproductive labor and organizing this space to be a kind of settlement in a sense. So I think that question of type and the emergence of gay men in California also through the camp might be interesting. Yeah.
I know we're out of time, but just a very quick thing, because I mean, going back to the question of queerness is definitely way less vague than we think. I think it's a very good intuition, but I'm also really curious to see how it shifted through time, because here for the queer subject, or rather for the gay subject, really the idea of escaping the limitations of the single family apartment was a moment of emancipation. But we know that right now the struggle for many queer families is actually the opposite, to be to actually be able to be together.
Yeah.
We have right now, for instance, in Italy, like a huge battle on recognizing actually, for instance, same-sex couple who are raising a child. So I think that maybe the thesis can be critical, not critical in a negative sense, but let's say can be aware of the fact that also there's not one kind of historical queerness, right? And maybe what was a battle actually 100 years ago, maybe for us today, we might be actually facing other types of battles, right?
Thank you.